You're listening to Manufactured with Kim van der Weert
and Jessie Lee, a podcast about sustainability and the making of fashion.
Join us every week in conversation with the people who manufacture what we wear. Do you own a pair of designer glasses? Have you ever thought about who makes the handy little cleaning cloth that comes with your glasses?
Our episode today is an interview with Piet Holten, founder of Pactics, the manufacturing company that makes so many of these little cloths.
Both Jessie and I used to work for Pactics, so we know Piet quite well, and as a result, we cover a lot of ground in this episode.
If you stick with us until the end, we will debrief a bit about some of the important themes that come up. For example, what lessons can sustainable fashion advocates draw from Piet's decision to make his factory in the provinces instead of the city?
And how does the common practice of designating supply chain partners' risks to be minimized instead of assets in which to invest pose a challenge to equal partnership?
Piet shares some of his experiences dealing with highly specialized decision-making within brands and the tension between purchasing and sustainability departments. We will share some of our own experiences with this too, and try to find a constructive frame for talking about the problem.
Yeah, and listeners, Piet shares quite a bit about his role financing the cost of production for his customers, for brands, even going so far as to call himself a bank. We'll unpack in a little bit more detail what this means and how it ties into a potential shift in perspective from supply chain partners as liabilities to supply chain partners as potential assets. Piet's story certainly gave us a lot to think about, and we hope you enjoy it too.
Welcome, Piet, to Manufactured.
Thank you for joining us today. I want to start by having you just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's Pactics? Who's Piet Holten? What kind of products do you make? Where do you operate? Paint us a picture.
Who is Piet Holten? I'll keep that short. I'm born in Holland. I left Holland 33 years ago on a tour around the world. The tour has not finished. Made me live in 4 different continents and met a lot of cultures. And Pactics was founded in 2004. During a period I lived in the United States, actually in Tucson, Arizona. And Pactics started being a trading company to import fabrics out of China to a factory in Mexico that was making pouches for Oakley sunglasses. So that was the start of Pactics in 2004. That led to not only buying microfiber fabric in China, but also making the pouches for Oakley in China. And that again led to starting Pactics Shanghai in 2008 as a manufacturing company to produce these pouches in our own factory.
And how many pouches do you think you make a year?
Yeah, so we do a little bit more than just the pouches. We also make cleaning cloths. It's between 35 and 40 million products at the moment. When we started in 2008 with our own factory, we were doing about 6 million pouches. And that has grown to about 35 to 40 million at the moment, pouches and cloths. So the cloths are a little bit higher than the pouches. I think we make 12 to 14 million pouches, and the rest are cleaning cloths, which is the same fabric, just instead of a pouch with a drawstring, it's a little cloth.
How did Pactics shift from being a trading company to a manufacturer? And it's worth just pausing for a moment to explain what a trading company is. A trading company is a company that sources products from one country and sells them in another. So in your case, you were sourcing these eyeglass pouches from China and selling them to Oakley. You weren't actually making them yourself yet.
Basically, it was born out of a desire to offer a better working place for employees than the suppliers that I used to work with were offering. So when we started producing these products in China, we had a number of suppliers, small family-owned factories that made these. the working conditions in these factories were very miserable. After almost 2 years of trying, I decided that I gave up on that and started my own factory.
And that was originally in China, right?
That was in Shanghai, China, yes.
And now you're producing primarily in Cambodia, correct? Or only in Cambodia?
We're producing at the moment only in Cambodia. So 2008 we started in China. In 2010 we started our first pilot operation in Cambodia. That was basically driven by the fact that I saw China getting more and more expensive. So the end of cheap China was coming. And I was right with that, because in 2013, we could no longer produce really in Shanghai. We wouldn't get any licenses anymore where we were. So we had to move anyway, and we decided then to move to the entire factory to Cambodia. So 2010 was the first start of Pactics Cambodia. We started with 15 people, and in a town called Siem Reap in the northeast of Cambodia. Northwest of Cambodia. And a town that is mostly known for its tourism, because the very famous Angkor Wat temples are there. Today we have 500 plus staff in Cambodia, in our own facility that we built from scratch and opened in March 2014.
And could you tell us a little bit about why Siem Reap? Why not Phnom Penh? I mean, for people who know Cambodia, they'll know that most of the garment industry in Cambodia is in the capital, in Phnom Penh. And when you tell people that you have a garment factory in Siem Reap, they look at you like you're crazy.
Yes. Everybody said that I was crazy when I proposed to set up the factory in Siem Reap. There were a couple of reasons. One was that in China, we worked a lot with migrant workers. And migrant workers are people that come from the province and work for a temporary period to the coast to make money. So the experience I had with migrant workers was that they don't really want to live there. They just come to make as much money as they can at the shortest periods of time as they can to go back to their hometowns. And that leads to a lot of staff turnover. And it also leads to a environment where they basically want to work a lot of overtime, which is expensive, because the whole motivation is to save a lot of money in a short period of time, so they can have, with that savings, can start something in their hometowns. And that is also the case more or less in Cambodia. Phnom Penh as the capital is really too small for all the big factories that are around Phnom Penh. I mean, there's 800,000 people working in the garment industry in Cambodia. So there you have the same problem happening. People are pulled out of the provinces, mainly young ladies, and they are put in these factories that are all in the outskirts of Phnom Penh. And they are forced to basically live in dormitories, or they live in very, very substandard housings, close to the factories. And of the little money they make, they have to send a lot back home. So there is not, it's not a nice living. So my question was really, why do you have to bring the people to the factory? Why do you have to bring the people from the province to the factory? Why don't you bring the factory to the people? Why don't you set up your factory where the people live? Then you will get a much more stable workforce. People can go home and don't have to stay in overfilled, very filthy dormitories or substandard housing. Better care for the people, and they have a social life. And of course, their salaries contribute to the family income, but when the family of that money can buy a TV, at least they can watch it. For me, it was like more or less a logical thing to do, but because it was so foreign to everybody thought this was a crazy idea. It would not work. And I must also say our products are very small. I mean, we can get 450 cartons with 2,000 products, or almost a million products in a container, a 20-foot container. So when we are further away, of course, from the port than in Phnom Penh. From Phnom Penh, it's 4 or 5 hours to the port. We are closer to 10, 12 hours from the port. So there's more expensive and longer logistics, but when you make small products, it's not that much of an extra cost. And the benefit you get to have your people close is tremendous. I mean, of the 15 people we started with in 2010, we still have people working for us.
Right.
And we have a very stable workforce. In China, I had a turnover of 15% a month. In Siem Reap, I have 10% a year. Very low sick leave.
You and I both know, I mean, I had quite some years of experience working in Phnom Penh, and it was really tough because people are far from their families. They're in this sort of ecosystem of garment factories, and it makes it really tough to build up a relationship of trust between management and workers, because you're sort of, you're trying to build up a rapport and establish a relationship in an ocean of ill will and abuse of or
misery.
Poor treatment and misery and poor treatment of vulnerable workers. I want to pivot a little bit, and I want to ask you about when Oakley was bought by Luxottica and the impact that had on Pactics.
Okay, so Oakley got acquired by Luxottica, I think it was in 2008 or 9. And for the first years, it was business as usual. We worked for Oakley. We had a sole suppliership. So
what's a sole suppliership?
So that meant that Oakley was not buying the microfiber products anywhere else, and we were not allowed to work for other companies, eyewear companies, because Oakley didn't want any advances they did or any new products that they developed that other people that would visit our company could see that. So the sole suppliership was for them a way to keep new product developments under the hood. And for us, it was a guarantee that when Oakley grew, that we grew with them. And that was a very good relationship, because we started, as I said, to work with Oakley, in 2005, and Oakley grew quite a lot. I think we were making about 6 million pouches in the beginning, and around 2010 we were making around 10 million. So it was a good relationship. There was a relationship of trust. They were a tough company to work for. I mean, quality standards were very high, but they were a fair company to work with. And then it became a little bit. Luxottica was, of course, a lot larger than Oakley. They had many brands that they were producing and licensed.
And just for our listeners out there, when we talk about licensing in this context, what we mean is that Luxottica has the right to produce and sell sunglasses on behalf of a lot of the big name brands. So, for example, when you buy a pair of Bulgari sunglasses, that brand has been licensed to Luxottica, and Luxottica is the one who is organizing and arranging for those products to be made and to be distributed. And then on top of that, of course, they also have their own brand.
Their main own brand was Ray-Ban. And with the purchase of Oakley, they wanted also to have a sports brand, because Oakley's foundation was in sports. Then they worked for all the big famous fashion houses where they made the sunglasses in license. So They had about 15 brands that they worked for. So that was all the big names: Prada, Armani, Versace, Tiffany, Coach,
Michael Kors.
Burberry, Michael Kors, you name it. Sets the pricing by not only having the manufacturing, but also controlling a large part of the retail. So companies like Landcrafter and Sunglass Hut are owned by Luxottica. And with that, they have made it a very expensive item. Ray-Ban sunglasses, when they were still owned by Bausch & Lomb in the US, were selling at gas stations for $10, $15. I mean, a pair of sunglasses, there's not much to a pair of sunglasses. I mean, to produce them is a lot less, but the balance between what they cost to make and what they are sold for. But okay, that's a fact of life. So the first encounters with the Luxottica way of doing business was quite dramatic, actually, for us, because I was told that sole supplierships was not something that Luxottica was favoring, that they already had a lot of suppliers for the microfiber, and they were not really sure that they needed us. And our prices were way too high compared to what they could get them for in China. And secondly, they wanted to reduce the number of suppliers. So basically, the message was that all the years that we worked for Oakley, the value of that was quite quickly diminished. This was all in 2011 when that happened. Yes, and they were doubtful if they wanted to continue doing business with us. And I had a contract with Oakley, which they basically canceled. I had a 5-year contract that I would supply all the pouches for a certain price and keep my sole suppliership. But that was canceled by Luxottica. Well, there was, I think, at that moment, 2 years left on the contract. Legally, they couldn't cancel the contract, but my only way to basically fight this was to go and sue them, which I didn't think that I would stand a chance against such a big corporation. And they knew that. I mean, they knew that I wouldn't try that. So after thought about this for a few days, I went back to them and said, okay, I will agree that you cancel the contract, but then I want to bid on the rest of your products. Because I wanted to keep basically the factory alive and the work for the people alive. And I felt that when I was only doing the pouches, that I was soon being replaced by an existing supplier Luxottica had. So they agreed on that, and that means that we went from a company of about 100, a little bit over 100 people, to a company of over 300 people in less than 18 months, and started to make Ray-Ban cloths, started to make all the cloths for Prada, for Bulgari, for Versace, Armani. And at the meantime, we were increasing our capacities in Cambodia and building the new factory in Cambodia. So that all happened almost at the same time. In order to get more volume, we had to reduce our prices. And that has been a continuous theme for us working with Luxottica. Their view on life is that you can increase efficiencies every year, and you should do that as a factory. And the customer should basically benefit from that. So they really demand somewhere between 3 and 5%.
By customer, you mean Luxottica, right? Not the consumer.
Yes.
Okay.
So by default, they demand 3 to 5% cost reductions every year. Yeah, that would be okay when you take into account the cost increases also, but that was not allowed. So, just to give you an idea, when I started in 2010 in Cambodia, the minimum wage in the garment industry was $65 a month, which I thought was criminal. We started our factory at $85 a month, which was still low, but in a town as Siem Reap seemed to be doable. So in the years up to 2018, wages have gone up to what are they now?
Over $200.
$190. Yeah.
Once you include all the benefits and things like that.
Yeah. So so those cost increases, microfiber went up in price. We were not allowed to take into account. So to give you an idea, in 2010, an Oakley pouch I sold to Oakley for 31 cents. That same pouch is sold today to Luxottica for 21 cents. So it's two-thirds of the price.
Right, that's
while costs
crazy.
have gone way up. Yes, I mean in 2010 in China the minimum wage was like a little bit over $100 a month, and now the minimum wage is like $700 a month in China. So it is, and our prices only went down. And the second argument they are using for price reduction is that there's other companies that can do it cheaper. Now that is, of course, something that is hard to prove. So every year we reduce prices, and the difference between us and the competition, and that competition is in China. They admit that competition is in China. Stays at a constant of 20%. We are 20% more expensive year over year over year over year. While we reduce price.
That's what
we never
they
seem
tell
to
you.
catch up. That's what they tell us. And then you ask yourself, how can a company in China compete with us in Cambodia while our wages are so much lower in Cambodia than China? And they do business with the same suppliers I did business with in 2005, and which I decided that they were not worth doing business with. So the compliance of these factories is extremely low. These factories do a lot of outsourcing to illegal outsource places, I would call it, to private homes. And that's how they can keep their costs down. But of course, that is not that's not allowed according to the CSR requirements of a company like Luxottica, because when you go to their website, they have a set of rules that is quite impressive. Now, then you ask yourself, why are these rules not enforced? And then you find out how this works in these big corporations. And I don't think that Luxottica in that sense is an exception. The way they organize this is that, and I'm not sure if they do it on purpose, but the reality is, and the practice is, that this is how it works. You have compliance departments whose tasks is to make sure that there is compliance in the supply chain. And then you have the purchasing departments and sourcing departments whose task it is to buy as cheap as possible and also reduce purchasing costs year over year over year. I mean, that's where the drive in price reductions comes from.
Right.
And what you also see that the compensations of the people in the purchasing department are mainly driven by that price reduction, because that's easy to calculate. You save so much for the company, then your bonus is X.
Right.
They have no obligation at all to make sure that where they buy is 100% compliant. And every time you refer to that with the sourcing department, they said, that's not our department. Our compliance department takes care of that. Then you come with the compliance department and you say, but how is it possible that you use factories that are not compliant? They said, that's impossible. All our factories that we use are audited. We have audit reports. None of the factories we do business with, of the people we do business with, are non-compliant. So then you ask yourself, but how is that possible? How can that contradict each other? And they both were telling the truth. So what you find then is that the factories they buy from, they don't buy direct from. So they either have traders in between, or they buy from one factory that buys from the other factory. So the one factory they have on the list and on the books is 100% compliant. But the factory where it's made is not. And then you ask yourself, does Luxottica know that? Yeah, of course Luxottica know that, because they visit these factories where it's made. The sourcing department and the quality people do that. But in the books of Luxottica, when you go to the headquarters and ask the compliance department, they have all green check marks behind all the suppliers and say, these suppliers, this is where we buy from, this is the supplier we pay, this is the supplier that is listed for this product. And they are all compliant. Like Pactics in Cambodia is, we are fully compliant.
And just to give people a sense, how much more expensive is Pactics than a non-compliant facility?
When a company in China that is competing with us had to pay full wages to everybody, had to pay full overtime to everybody, had to pay full social security to everybody, which is mandatory by law, which is not happening, and would not outsource to private homes and other less favorable places, then they wouldn't be able to compete with us. Yes, it's not that we are so much more expensive because we are compliant. Compliance for us is not a major cost, but I'm not competing on a level playing field. I'm competing against a company that breaks the rules. That's why they can compete with us. That's why Luxottica can keep claiming they are 20% cheaper than us, because it's not a level playing field. It's not comparing apples to apples. And when you come to the compliance at Pactics Cambodia, for us it's not a cost. For us it is a matter of, to have a safe environment in your factory is a right that your employees have. Yes? And because you have a safe environment is one of the things that you are compliant. You can't view that as an extra cost. Yes?
Right.
When you don't have a safe working environment, it's simply criminal.
Right.
So it's you either have a safe environment or you don't have one. Yes? And then you shouldn't have a factory.
Right.
Yeah? There is no compromise on safety. There is no compromise on the health of your employees. Now, why do we have a daycare center? Do we do that because it's by law? That's not the full reason. We have a daycare center so that my trained workers after maternity leave can come back to work.
Right.
And that is a benefit for the company. It's also a benefit for the worker that we have a daycare center because they don't lose income when they get a baby. So these are things that people rave about when they come and visit Pactics, and they think about Pactics as a wonderful thing, and the nickname of Pactics in Siem Reap is the Pactics Resort.
Well, it is quite lush and quite green.
Yeah, it is, but it all has a reason. I mean, the lush and green is to help cooling the buildings. We having a factory in the tropics, yes, and from an environmental point of view, you don't want to spend on air conditionings, and because they are a tremendous polluting when you think about it. When you look at the amount of electricity they use.
Right.
We have a lot of daylight in our factory. That is a little bit more costly to build, but gives a lot of benefits because it gets a very, very friendly, spacious, light working environment. During the day, we don't need any electrical light. That's how much light we have in the factory. And putting people that are used to light and are used to outdoor in a dark hole is not going to do much for your productivity. So that's why we have all the light.
So I want to shift also now to talk a little bit, or to ask you to share a little bit about the day-to-day operations at Pactics. So could you tell us a little bit about where your raw materials come from and how far in advance they have to be ordered, how you decide how much you're going to order? Paint us a picture of how that works.
Okay, so again, out of cost reasons, most of our materials come from China. It's still the cheapest place to buy it.
And there aren't very many raw fabrics being produced in Cambodia, right?
There's hardly any in Cambodia. There's a few cotton plants, but there's hardly anything produced. So everything has to be imported. So we have a sourcing company in China. It used to be in Shanghai, but we moved it out of cost reasons again to Wuxi, which is about 125 kilometers from Shanghai, a small little town of 8 million people that nobody has heard of. So there we have a warehouse, and we have about 10 people that deal with our suppliers in China, that consolidate the containers. Every 2 weeks, we ship a container to Siem Reap with materials. It's about 2 weeks door to door, which is, of course, adds to our cost. Our cost of the material is about 10 to 12% higher than when I would be operating in China. So that's the cost of the operation and the extra logistics cost we have.
I want to talk a little bit about timeline. So from the moment you decide to order then until the moment you receive the raw materials in Cambodia, how much time elapses?
We give our main suppliers for the microfiber and for the woven polyester fibers that we use for the travel and luggage products, we give them a forecast.
I just want to elaborate a little bit quickly on what a forecast is for our listeners who might not be aware or who haven't heard this term before. But a forecast is a prediction for how much of a particular good you're going to sell. So you have forecasts at multiple levels. For example, Pactics will get a forecast from its customer, Luxottica, about how many pieces Luxottica thinks it's going to sell. And then Pactics will in turn use that to make plans for how many raw materials they need to buy, how many people they need to have on staff to produce the given forecasted quantity. And that forecast basically gets passed down. So Pactics will receive that forecast from Luxottica, but Pactics will also pass that on to its raw material suppliers so that they can do the same thing, so that they can also plan for their inputs and for their labor.
So they produce what we call the grade goods mainly on forecast. Grade goods are basically woven undyed. Or dyed, undyed. So woven or knitted fabrics that are not dyed. Then it takes about 2 weeks to dye.
And it's important to differentiate here between a forecast and a purchase order. Whereas a forecast is a prediction for how many pieces a brand thinks it might sell, a purchase order is a commitment to buy. It's a legally binding contract, which is also relevant in the face of canceled orders during global pandemic, because not only were these forecasts way off, but then the purchase orders came in, and even those aren't being honored. But I digress.
So the dyeing is done on the purchase orders we give them. And then when they ship, basically the clock starts ticking, and we receive the invoices from them monthly at the end of the month. And then we pay in 30, 45, or 60 days.
And then you have about a month to produce the products in Cambodia. before they ship out again.
It takes about 5 weeks to get to the destination, and there we stock it in our own warehouses.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to wait until the customer needs it. So we ship to 3 locations when it comes to Luxottica: China, Italy, and the US. And in all 3, we have a warehouse to store our finished goods. And the companies have 90 days to call off.
And here, call off means that the brand decides that they need it and that they're going to use it. And that's where when the ownership is transferred.
So when it arrives in the warehouse and they have not called it off within 90 days, then we can force them to call it off. And only when that's called off, we can invoice. And then we have 120 days end of the month payment term. So when you add this all up, from the moment we order the materials till we get paid for the finished goods is 6 to 7 months. So I've told the Luxottica once that I'm not a manufacturer or supplier to them. I'm their bank.
You're their bank, right? Which is crazy, right? Because the amount of profit you're making and the amount of revenue you have to be able to front these costs is, so marginal relative to their resources. Yeah.
No, it's not them.
I want to go back to forecasts for a minute. Can you tell us a little bit about the forecasts that you get from Luxottica or from other customers and what you do to increase the odds or the chances that they're correct? Because ultimately, that's when you're making the decision to buy, and that's when you assume quite a lot of risk.
So, but we also have a lot of history because we work with them for such a long time. So sometimes when we get a forecast, we already tell them this can't be right.
And how do you know that? Can you elaborate?
Because of the history and we know what they normally use. And you see, they can't watch every component, but for us, we have with Luxottica probably 50, 60 end items. For us to monitor that in detail, well, they probably have thousands and thousands of components they order every month. So for them to monitor that all in detail is much harder than for us. So when we see strange things like suddenly peaks or suddenly we don't see an item disappeared from the forecast, and there's normally something going on in their systems. Either the bill of material has changed, somebody made an engineering change and made a mistake in it. We had very, very strange things. We had situations where they were ordering suddenly.
So, I mean, Pactics plays an active role in helping Luxottica to forecast effectively. I mean, they'll give you some idea of what they want to produce, but you then go through it with a fine-tooth comb because you have such a good understanding about the history and about the company that you're actually in a position to say to them, hey, I don't think you've got this right.
Yeah, I mean, we got sometimes forecasts that we called them and said, you don't have capacity to make so many sunglasses. Why do you need so many bags?
Right.
And they said, how do you know how much capacity we have? I said, because we're doing business with you for 15 years. We know exactly what you can make.
I want to ask one more thing about the forecast, because when they give you a forecast and they say, okay, next month we're going to need, or in the next 6 months, we're going to need X number of pieces. Are they bound to their forecast? I mean, if they get it way wrong, what are the consequences? You do your best to adjust it, but sometimes it's still not quite right?
Yeah.
So what's the consequence?
Then these goods are shipped and these goods are in the warehouse, and then the 90-day rule starts to play. So when the 90-day rule comes in, but of course they want to get out of it. I mean, we have stock sitting there already for 2 years that they should have called off, and then they say, we'll do a little bit this quarter, because it looks bad on everybody's record to buy something that they don't use. Yes.
Right.
And nobody wants to admit that they made a mistake. and sometimes they change the bill of material, and I mean, a simple example is Ferrari. Oakley was making Ferrari bags and Ferrari glasses, and then Ray-Ban got on the Ferrari Formula One cars. Guess what? Oakley, they said to Oakley, Ray-Ban we need the Ferrari bags, sunglasses now to be made by Ray-Ban. So, bang, they changed that over a month, and there was all my Ferrari bags in stock.
So those are all still sitting in a warehouse somewhere.
They were sitting in a warehouse. We had materials for them. We had half-finished goods in the factory. So then we had a couple of years ago, not a couple of years, about 7-8 years ago, when the whole disaster with Lance Armstrong happened. So we were making Lance Armstrong sublimated bags, and that stopped overnight.
Right.
They had a contract with Shaun White, the famous snowboarder, Olympic. And then Shaun White canceled the contract, and we were sitting with I don't know how many Shaun White bags.
Right. And it's really interesting because I think this is a side of sustainability that people rarely think about, is the consequence of changing a product and all the waste that generates and that gets stuck in the system, and also who pays for that.
Yeah. We had stock sitting in the warehouse in the US. We had a containers outside full of obsolete Oakley stock that we only destroyed, I think, just 6 months ago. That has been there were, and that was stock they paid for. Yes, I mean it was not, but they couldn't use anymore. But before they could make a decision to pay for the destruction of that stock, because we couldn't just throw it away, it all had Oakley branding on it.
Right.
But before they got that approved, that they would pay for the destruction of that stock, that whole container full, that was quite a painful process, yes.
Yeah. So I want to wrap this conversation by asking you to share some of your thoughts about the future of Pactics and sustainability more generally in the fashion industry.
Oh, that's a big topic. That should be a podcast on its own.
That's true. That's true. But just your brief remarks.
During this conversation, we only have talked about Luxottica, and Luxottica is the history of Pactics. Yeah, we started with sunglasses, and we grew up with sunglasses. So on one end, I'm grateful to Luxottica because they made us the company we are today, and they help us to employ quite a lot of people in Siem Reap that deserve decent employment. So there are good and bad things with every relationship you have, and the good thing is that we have a very stable demand coming from Luxottica. Yes, and we should be grateful for that, and that is at the moment around 60% of our turnover. What is the future of Pactics? Pactics needs to have a much more balanced portfolio, and the dependency we have now on Luxottica is too high. And I mean, the Corona crisis has shown that, because their factories have been shut now since the second week of March. And you must understand, when these factories shut, there is no call-offs. And when there's no call-offs, there's no income for Pactics. So you have a hard, sudden stop. So we need different products. The Luxottica cloths have very low labor content. I mean, a cloth has a little bit of printing on it or embossing on it, and it's basically, you have material, you cut it, you fold it, put it in a plastic bag, and put it in a box. So the labor content on a cloth is very low. When we have products in Cambodia with low labor content, it's harder for us to compete with China, because China has the advantage on the logistics, and their labor is higher. But when the labor content is low, then the advantages for us with the lower labor are less. I mean, that's logic. So we need products with a higher labor content, because there we have a better
chance of being able to compete.
Yes. The second thing that we have in Cambodia is that we have a tremendous duty advantage now for travel and luggage goods, with shipping to the US.
Relative to China.
But relative to China and Vietnam, which are the biggest suppliers of travel and luggage goods. So Vietnam has a 17.6% duty to the US, and China, with the Trump madness, has now 42.7% duty to the US. So that is tremendous for these goods. And more companies are now prepared to switch, which was much harder to do before when we didn't have this duty advantage. Because customers don't want to switch. Switching supplier is always a huge risk. So the first one that did that is Chico Bags in Chico, Northern California. And they have basically switched their entire production to us. And the owner told me a few weeks ago that he was so happy about this switch because it's not only that we are more reliable than the supplier he had, we also produce a much higher quality than the supplier they had. So we need more Chicos. And why do we need more Chicos?
When you say Chico, you mean small to medium-sized companies or aligned with your values?
We need companies where we can add more than just being a manufacturer. See, for Luxottica, we are just a factory that makes products as cheap as possible for them. And there's very little added value we can add to that product because they have the full control over how the product looks like and how they want the product to be. When you work with a smaller factory or a smaller client, there you can add more value by controlling the logistics, by helping in the design, by proposing different materials, and then you basically have a more services added to your offering, and that makes you adds more value to the customer.
A more equal partner.
Yes, and you propose more value to the customer than just a product.
Right.
So that's what we try to do. So we are moving in a direction where we want to have more control over the product, and also have a product with a higher labor content, because that makes it easier for us to compete, and higher labor means also more people that we can put to work. So that was one of the things that's why we moved to Cambodia.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's interesting too.
Was that now the answer to your question? No, you asked about sustainability.
No. Well, I think it is the answer to that, though, too, because I think, by entering into a supplier, brand, or client relationship on more equal footing, you're also able to negotiate terms which are more fair. And that's a big part of doing business more sustainably, right?
Yes. And those smaller companies are having more sustainable product in the first place. Chico Bags, for example, is very sustainable. They made it their mission to ban plastics out of the world. So all their materials are recycled, they avoid using any plastics, any plastic packaging. So that's very, very prominent in their products and in their company culture. But it's also easier with these companies to have discussions about that. Yes.
To propose ideas.
When I think about it, that we make 18 million Ray-Ban cloths a year, and they all go into a little poly bag that basically is immediately discarded when the customer gets the glasses, is sad, because it's a mountain of plastic every year.
Right.
18 million little poly bags.
Yeah. And when you try and introduce new ideas to big customers like that, there's a lot of resistance, right?
It has no attention. The problem is the only reply you get is, will it be cheaper? You say,
and
no,
even
it will
then,
not be cheaper. Then they say, then we are not interested to even discuss it. So so there is no drive with them to do something more sustainable.
Right. All right. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your story. Okay, before we conclude this episode, Jesse and I want to unpack some of the things that Pete talked about. Let's start with the idea of putting the factory in the province instead of the city. Something that's worth pausing to highlight here is the conditions that made it possible for him to have his factory in Siem Reap. I mean, he mentions the fact that his products in general are very small. And so the extra cost of, being further from the port and having to transport them a longer distance is minimal because his products are small.
Right.
His products are also quite simple. And don't require a lot of skill. And most of the highly skilled sewers in Cambodia are in Phnom Penh. And so, this is also a condition that for him specifically made putting a factory in Siem Reap possible. And I think that that's worth pausing on because, I think that especially in sustainability speak, there's a tendency to see a good thing and to say, well, we should do it like that everywhere. All factories should be moved to the province. I think that's not the lesson to draw from this example. I think a much more valuable lesson to draw from this example is that what makes sense from a social responsibility perspective really depends on context, the social context of the country you're in, the kind of business that you have, the kind of products that you're making.
Yeah. I think context is really something we needed to disclose or highlight it here. After all, if Pactics is producing something quite complicated like outdoor backpacks or something like jeans, let's say, then setting up a factory in Siem Reap will dramatically increase the cost a lot because you need to source all kinds of accessories, right? And we are far from a center of, let's say we are far from Phnom Penh. All the small suppliers are in Phnom Penh. So the accessories will take lots of time for us to source and to get it in Siem Reap. And then the logistic cost, sourcing cost, time cost, communication cost all increase. So the context, yes, as you said, is very important. Pete can do so also because of the context.
Yeah, and I think it plays in pretty directly to equal partnership as well. When we talk about equal partnership across the supply chain, I mean, brands who are not doing production themselves will not know what makes sense based on context. And yet the door to that communication right now, I think, is just closed because there's so much supplier fear of retribution. And so I think it's not only that we need to consider context, but also that the sustainability agenda needs to consider and to focus on ways that sort of open those doors and those lines of communication and make suppliers feel a little safer so that they can put that knowledge forward.
Yes, and to make them feel safer, it's also very important to play fair. By saying play fair, I mean you play competitions on the same ground. So if the brands or the companies or let's say purchasing side can make competitions, can compare cost or prices on in the same ground, then suppliers definitely will feel much safer to speak out what they think and the reasons behind their decisions. I think trust here is quite important. And back to the decisions Pete made for setting up factories in Siem Reap, I think another very interesting thing I want to highlight is he considered awareness of his workers. He considered he would like them to leave home and go to factories every day. So in the night can go back home instead of cramble in a dormitory. So basically he see his workers or his employees as assets. Their awareness eventually is his goodness. His awareness.
Exactly. His success depends on them. And there's very much a recognition of that. And that is very much in contrast to the relationship then between him and his customer, where, I mean, you see it when he talks about shifting from, or when Oakley was bought by Luxottica, and that when he was working with Oakley, that he had a sole supplier contract, and that there was an interest and an advantage to that for both sides.
Yes.
And that when he was bought out by Luxottica, that sole supplier contract was basically seen as a risk, right? And to have, because you have all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And so, basically what that is saying is that supply chain partners or suppliers are a liability and are a risk to be managed, rather than an asset worth investing in the way that Piet, in his particular case, has chosen to invest in his people, right? And so I think for me, that's a fundamental question, is how, as an industry, as a sustainability advocates, do we go from seeing suppliers as liabilities, and risks that need to be minimized, to actually assets worth investing in? And equal partnership really depends on that, because it's impossible to talk about equal partnership if the point of departure is that suppliers are
liabilities.
Liability.
Yeah. You cannot have an equal relationship with someone if you see them as a risk to be managed, or a cost needs to always press down, or a liability.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me feel in a company like let's say a brand, or in a buying company, it makes me feel the sustainability department or compliance department and the purchasing and sourcing team seems they are not in the same decision-making process, that's for sure, but they are also not on the same positions. It gives me a feeling since I step into textile industry that sourcing and purchasing department has the biggest power. They can decide many things, which is sometimes not exactly constant with the direction of sustainability.
You could even take it a step further, and you could say that these highly specialized departments pretty directly serves to circumvent or avoid accountability and ownership over decisions. I've been wondering about this when we talk about sustainability. People have asked me at times, when I've written articles or said things like, well, I've worked with people within brands who, don't seem to understand the consequence of their decisions on me and my team. And people have responded to that sometimes by saying, well, is more training the answer? Do we need to provide more training to staff working within brands so that they understand the consequences of their actions? And examples like, what Piet has just set out and what you've just described kind of make me skeptical, because I'm like, is the problem really? Okay, yes, maybe maybe brand employees don't understand the consequences of their actions on their suppliers. But even if they did in this example, what power would they have to do anything about it? I don't know how many times I've been told, well, I'm sorry, but these are our company's rules.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
That's where we need to be looking at, is those rules that govern decision making within brands. I think training is a bit.
It's too light to say, it's too naive. Yeah, it's too naive.
Yeah.
The right angle to think about all this maybe is how the power,
the right framing.
Yes, the right framing, how the decision power is distributed inside of a company, inside of a brand company. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that like a nice way to tie this up too is when Piet says Piet at some point says, well, I've told Luxottica that I'm not a factory, I'm their bank. And, this just goes to further show, and he goes on to say that, or to outline the timeline, which basically shows that, he's financing the cost of production 6 or 7 months in advance before he ever sees any money for his products. And I'd say that that's a pretty valuable asset, right? And that and that just goes to underscore just how somehow absurd it is that we've gotten into this world where it seems normal to treat your supply chain partners as a risk, as a liability. And then he later goes on to also explain, and I was part of this too in my capacity when I was general manager of one of the Pactics facilities, is, he goes through their forecast with a fine-tooth comb and spots their mistakes and opens the discussion when he sees things that he feels are a problem or are not reasonable. Again, I'd say that's a pretty valuable asset. And yet somehow it feels so controversial or, like you're coming in from outer space to say that we should be seeing suppliers as an asset,
Yeah. Instead of seeing us as a cost to be controlled or risks to be managed, let's say. I feel quite excited when I heard Piet said factory is a bank. Finally, someone speak out the truth. Often people have a misunderstanding because when buyers or when brands place orders, sometimes brand will place a deposit. So I think it's very important to mention those deposits are not cannot fully cover the investment materials and human resources that a factory invested at the beginning. And you need to make space on your planning, on your schedule. So it means if this order is lost, your raw material cost might get covered, might not. However, it also means there is a certain period of time.
Opportunity.
Is empty, is wasted over there. Yeah.
We waste so much time basically trying to find ways of coping with uncertainty.
That's why.
Time and resources.
Yeah, that's why I think what Piet provided, what he can provide and what he provided already, and also what other factories provided already are very valuable. It's not just a bank of money. It's not just upfront some money invested into raw materials or equipment. It's also experiences. The whole experience is helping the customers to control risks. Basically, to make
knowing
sure.
How to do this, knowing how to have a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and having a team and an infrastructure that allows you to deploy plan A one day and plan C the next day. Because that's not easy.
And all this just to make sure the goods will arrive on the customer side on time.
I know.
Yeah, something we think it should be, but actually it's not should be. It's something put lots of efforts to get it. So
it feels, I think on the customer side, it often is perceived as, especially today in the days of Amazon, where you buy something online today and you get it tomorrow. It's like, I think really taken for granted how much work goes into making that possible.
Yeah. Yeah. So what Piet mentioned at the end is really interesting. It's really valuable. It's not just the money invested in upfront. It's also experiences, knowledges, skills, and the whole team of work.
Right. And I think it's worth also highlighting the note that Piet concludes on, which is that he is really clearly very grateful to Luxottica, despite, the challenges. He makes a point of highlighting also the stable demand that Luxottica offers. And I think that this is something that is worth pointing out too, because it is quite unusual in the fashion industry, whereas with the eyewear industry, and the particular kind of product that Pactics is making, the demand is a little bit more stable. It's not quite as up and down. And that also has pretty directly enabled him to have his staff on permanent contracts instead of relying on outsourcing partners. And I think it makes sense to wrap up on this stable demand or constant demand, because it's a recurring theme that I think we'll see again and again in our conversations and our episodes. Piet, thank you once again for joining us today and sharing your story. And that does it for us this week, Manufactured listeners.
Thank you for listening to Manufactured.
To learn more about our guests and the issues we've chatted about today, check out our website, manufacturedpodcast.com, or find us on Instagram at manufactured_podcast.
We'd also love to hear your stories and what you think. Collecting with listeners is the most rewarding part of what we do, so please don't be shy. Leave comments on Instagram or connect with us privately through our website.
To be the first to find out about new episodes, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd also love it if you left us a review. Leaving a review helps other people find our show, and we'd love your help with that.
Thanks for listening, and see you next week.